Hi! Today we are going to create a grid map picker with Godot 4. The result will appear like this. Oops, no, and not exactly this one, but this other one instead. Let's start by setting up the Godot project and the terrain grid map. The grid map requires a terrain mesh lib, and to build a mesh lib we need some terrain meshes. So, now let's switch to Blender to create two basic meshes. If you are only interested in the object coloring technique, you can skip directly to 1050. The first mesh is a kind of flat terrain, a green meadow, where we can put a house. The second mesh, on the other hand, is a hilly terrain. Okay, now just save the Blender project into the Godot project folder. And if the editor settings are correct, the file is imported automatically. We can add a collision shape to each mesh of an instantiated mesh lib by selecting all of them and using the Create Collision Shape helper. Since 3D tiles of our island are in place, we need the sandy bottom and the sea. Once the terrain is completed, we will need a cursor object controllable by the player to select the objects that we will place on the terrain. First, we create the base mesh of the 3D cursor in Blender, and then we refine it in Godot, also adding the rules to move it on the terrain grid map. To make sure that the cursor is always visible even when it is behind other objects, we can override the default material and use a shader made this way. Now the most tricky part, the cursor control script. In this demo, it will be used to both select objects and move them. Okay, it can follow the mouse pointer, but now we need to build the objects to select. Let's download them from sketchfab.com. Object meshes are ready, so we use them to create another mesh lib and an object grid map that will be aligned with the terrain grid map just created. The object grid map is also ready. We can use even more meshes, because the cursor will use the mesh lib indices to pick up the objects and move them. And now we add the code to catch and release objects, using an additional mesh instance node to host the mesh we are moving. The object capture and release actions will be activated by pressing a key on the keyboard. Initially, we assign to the pivot node the mesh taken directly from the mesh lib, but then it will be necessary to duplicate it to avoid modifying all the objects. Oops! The position of the pivot object must take into account the height of the terrain. Okay, now we can color the moving mesh. To do this, we temporarily use the pivot node to create a shaded material that we will reuse for all the surfaces to be colored. let's move on to the coloring technique. We duplicate the textured mesh from the mesh lip and then add shader material to each surface. The shader must have a lower priority than the original surface material. We can do this by changing its rendering priority. The shader is disabled by default, but we can change its behavior using the parameter. We will use it to switch from red to green based on the compatibility between the object and the terrain. We can also avoid rotating the object along with the cursor. And that's all for today. Thank you for watching this long. Bye.